Welcome back. So our guest speaker today is Dr. Simeon Hein. The subject matter is the science of remote viewing, connecting human psychic ability to PK, UFOs, and paranormal subjects. So if you want to know about remote viewing, you are in the right room. Dr. Simeon Hein is a former professor of statistics and research methods. He first became involved with remote viewing in '96 and took a class as an open-minded skeptic. The surprisingly positive training results convinced Dr. Hein that a large area of scientific knowledge is withheld from public discussion. Subsequently, he began teaching remote viewing classes in Boulder, Colorado, and still does. He also became interested in crop circles, UFOs, and extraterrestrials. Dr. Hein will look at the UFO-Bigfoot connection, and if you were here at his presentation last year, we touched on that also, and some fundamental characteristics common to paranormal phenomena such as strange lights, orbs, sudden camera and battery failure, rapid temperature changes, and space-time distortions. He'll show how these specific experiences relate to coherent matter and research in low-energy nuclear reaction. Dr. Simeon will explain how, Dr. Hein.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Simeon, right? We'll explain how witness descriptions and encounters with Bigfoot support these ideas as discussed in his new book, Dark Matter Monsters, Cryptoids, Ball Lightning, and the Science of Secret Life Forms, which I have just finished reading recently. Dr. Hein is the Director of Research and Teaching company, the Mount Baldy Institute, founded in '97 to give people the opportunity to learn remote viewing, a type of intuition training that taps into our unconscious intelligence. He also studies crop circles and has taken people on crop circle tours in the UK. So buckle up, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hein.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out on such a cold day. We actually have some people here from my RV classes from way back. We have Elaine here again, who was here last time, which is nice to see people from way back. And of course, Seth and Anniversary also took the RV classes up in Boulder. So what I want to do today is give you some very exciting updates on a lot of this information, how it's sort of connected, at least for me, even since writing Dark Matter Monsters, learning about more science that connects a lot of these phenomena together. And I guess my goal has always been, how are these phenomena connected? Seeing RV results, which I'll show you in a moment, I've always wondered, like, how do people actually do this? How do they connect to a non-local target, so to speak? How do they get some accurate information from something that's hundreds of miles away with no advanced information? And I think we're beginning to see a picture how this really connects to other phenomena, what we've called paranormal phenomena. I think we've called it paranormal just because we really didn't understand it. But I think the physics has really been there for over 150 years, and we're gonna look at some of that. Then I'm gonna show you some RV sessions, which people like Elaine and Seth will already be familiar with. And maybe you've seen some of my presentations. We're gonna look at what RV sessions actually look like. Then we'll take a small break. And then for those of you that want to try some RV, I've actually got some targets lined up. And you can give it a shot to see, how well you do. Now, all sessions are good sessions if you learn something about yourself. That's the bottom line. So that's the plan for today. So, the jellyfish, I just want to say one thing about it. I think for those of you that have been following my platform, I think you know what I think those are. I think those are dark matter life forms. And I'm about to show you, I think there's increasing evidence for a shadow type of life form, not just a shadow type of life form, an entire shadow universe that we're around all the time that is very hard to detect. It does relate to dark matter and neutrinos and types of matter that don't have any charge but just have a little bit of mass that are very hard to detect, that science is always looking for. But it's a little more than that. It appears that there is an entire universe of dark matter and dark life that's around us. And if that is true, I personally think, just since we saw it a few minutes ago, that Iraq jellyfish could be one of those type of life forms, since people have seen that type of thing, whatever it is, in different places around the world, according to my research over the past week or so. So in any case, let me show you why I think a lot of these topics connect. And of course, you're welcome to challenge me in the question and answer session afterwards before we do our V if you don't agree with any of this. But, so my background, first of all, I'm actually not trained as a physicist. I'm a former statistics teacher, research methods. I come out of sociology. I think sociology really helps here because we're dealing with people's experiences. Just think about the trucker case we just heard from Anniversary and Seth. I mean, how many times have you heard people saying, I never want to think about it again, I don't want to go through Colorado again? I've heard this a lot, especially relating to cryptid and Bigfoot encounters in Colorado and throughout the West, including friends of mine. And you often get this reaction, I don't want to think about it again, I don't even want to talk about it. And that's something that sociologists are familiar with because one common aspect of how society reacts to these topics, it's called stigma. And you're familiar with this. And it's something that can be wielded against witnesses to these phenomena, whistleblowers and so forth. And that's why social science is a part and parcel of all these topics, because we're dealing with how society treats people who have experiences that don't fit the particular storyline we were taught in school, and how we treat people like that. And it's something we've always dealt with and we always will. And it's particularly true to witnesses to UFOs and orbs and other types of life forms where they encounter something that is very hard to describe and they share it and it's uncomfortable for them. So I think you know what I'm talking about, and that's why sociology, social sciences matter in these investigations as much as hard science approach to it. So where do we start, as far as I'm concerned, with getting to the bottom of how some of these topics are related? I think it has a lot to do with resonance and shapes. And we all have a particular frequency, we have a particular resonance, and we're familiar with sacred shapes, phi ratios, golden mean sections, certain mathematical proportions that nature seems to build in to biological systems, to life. And sometimes we've used these in art and in different types of structures. The phi ratio being the ratio of 1.618, which is actually how our bodies are constructed. If you look at the bone structure, just for example, and people knew this in the past, we're not taught about this anymore, but I think this has something to do with what we're talking about here. For example, if you look at the bone structure throughout your body, if the first digit structure, part of your finger is just 1, the next one is always 1.6 to the first section, and 1.6 on and on throughout your entire body. And it kind of works that way in many different types of biological structures. This is the Sri Yantra shape, which is built around the phi ratio. Leonardo da Vinci knew about this golden section and the golden mean. Folks a long time ago built things around this. And for example, Da Vinci found that from our navel to our head and then our navel to our legs, there was like this perfect proportions that he imagined for men and women. And we're also, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, our bodies are proportioned around these ratios. Buildings like the Parthenon were built around golden mean, golden section ratios. And this actually does matter more than you would think. It's not just that it feels comfortable because it's scaled in the way that our bodies are built. I actually think that structures that are built around certain ratios and shapes that are so common in nature actually channel and funnel certain types of energy, which we'll look at in a moment, which actually make them energetically active in ways that buildings nowadays that are just built around square shapes or perfectly round shapes for efficiency criteria are not actually going to have the same sort of, they don't have the same resonance, and they think energetically it matters. In our own bodies, for example, the inner ear is built around this sort of phi ratio shape. And if you read articles about how hearing works, we would not be able to hear if we didn't have that golden section built into our inner ear. It actually allows us to hear a certain range of frequencies, which you wouldn't get with another shape. And of course, heart, muscle, other types of organs have that sort of phi ratio geometry. In any case, the reason it matters is it gives us a specific frequency which allows us to pick up certain aspects of reality. In other words, we're not perceiving the entire spectrum of electromagnetic signals. We just see a certain range of them based on our shape and our tuning. And I think that this actually has a cosmological component to it, because a lot of galaxies and galactic structures are also built around these same patterns. So there's sort of like a continuum of energy from the macroscopic level all the way down to our bodies to the microscopic level. And this is a part of certain Eastern religions, Eastern spiritual practices like Taoism, for example, which emphasizes the role of spirals and imagining spirals and seeing the different shapes and so forth. I actually think that's not just a mental exercise. I actually think what we're talking about is what different religions and energetic practices, spiritual practices called chi energy. In Hebrew it's called the ruach, prana, different names for this sort of etheric type of energy. And even something like remote viewing recognizes, surprisingly, that there are certain times of day, not with respect to the sun, but with respect to something called sidereal time, where remote viewing accuracy is increased or decreased based on the position of the Earth relative to the Milky Way. The only way that, and I've seen the evidence for it, I was actually skeptical of it until Ed May, one of the people who ran Stanford Research Institute, after Hal Puthoff and Russ Targ, SRI being the place that the remote viewing program was developed for the CIA starting in 1972 or so. They found these sort of patterns with respect to sidereal time. And that would mean that there's something related to galactic energy that we're interacting with, just like I showed you with some of these pictures a few minutes ago, whereby those particles or those energies can enhance or detract from our viewability. In other words, that there's some connection between where we are here and the rest of the galaxy that affects something that you wouldn't really think it would matter if it was a purely mental function, right? But there's some sort of an energetic function. And different scientists have actually recognized this. You might not have heard about them, but one of them is Alexander Parkhomov, a Russian scientist who was a radiation expert in the Soviet Union working at the Moscow Aviation Institute. And he developed equipment on his own to measure what are called relic neutrinos. These are neutrinos that come from the cosmic background radiation, and they flux and they flow around gravitational objects like galaxies and suns and planets like us. And he was able to show that, similar to sidereal time, that the position of the Earth relative to galaxies and time of year could affect the flow of these relic neutrinos, and that in turn could affect biological processes, radioactive decay, distributions, and so forth. Things that you would normally expect to be very constant, he found there was variation correlating to relic neutrino flow. Now, these neutrinos are not the type that come from the sun, which are really fast and go through everything. You might have heard about them. They rarely run into anything, and there are detectors set up around the Earth to find one, like once a week they get a little hit because they're so small. These are larger particles that are on the order of microns to millimeters that interact with cells and molecules. And their variation affects us too. So this is one way in which there could be like a background etheric force that we're interacting with all the time that you can't see, that's hard to detect. He had to build his own equipment from surplus Soviet equipment. But these neutrinos, again, are just one aspect of what we call dark matter. Most of the research that I read about, and I got this from following Bob Greenyer and Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, who actually translated Parkhomov's book, Space, Earth, Human, which you can purchase for yourself and read about this. It's a little complex, but it's really interesting. These seem to make up about 0.5% to maybe 1.5%, maybe 2% of what we call dark matter. Dark matter being matter that outnumbers our visible, normal electromagnetic matter by maybe 5 or 10 to 1. So for everything we see around us, there's a lot more of this dark matter. Now, why does it, quote unquote, matter? Because for a long time, I think we thought that dark matter was something out there. It holds, it's another sort of material that holds galaxies together, originally suggested by us astrophysicist Zwirblis. I think he was at the University of Chicago at the time. They said there's just not enough physical matter in any galaxy to hold it together to account for the spiral rotation and things like angular momentum and things like that. So they said there has to be more matter there. Now, for a long time, we thought it's just way out there. It's holding the galaxies together. But this research suggests that it's here in the form, at least some of it, as these relic neutrinos, and that we're interacting with it all the time. And even things like these buildings we're around could affect the flow of these relic neutrinos. And that's why structures built around golden section, golden mean proportions could funnel or channel these relic neutrinos in a way that our modern square buildings that are just built around Euclidean geometry don't. And so we're interacting with these forces without even being aware of how we're interacting with them, which is why this sort of study of these sort of topics really could matter. For example, what does affect remote viewing accuracy? Is it something to do with these? People are wondering, are these relic neutrinos actually carrying information? You see, is this one of the things that carries information? And then when we absorb relic neutrinos, there are more of them outside than inside a building. We know this from cold fusion experiments because in some of these cold fusion, low energy nuclear reaction experiments, they stop working after a few days unless you open a window. Or you have to move them around the lab to another location, as if they've kind of used up all the relic neutrinos in that part of the lab and you need to go to another space. So it just means that there are components to our environment that we can't see that really could matter, that have a cosmological connection. So going back to RV for a second, this is a really good movie. I don't have any personal connection with it, but this is the most recent movie about the U.S. remote viewing program, and I recommend you take a look at it. It's on all the streaming services. If you don't know anything about RV, and after today you're a little more curious, this explains a lot of how it originated and so forth. So the story behind RV, and we're going to connect it into these different topics in a very interesting way. It starts during the Cold War when the US government finds out that the Soviet Union has about 20 different KGB programs in remote viewing, what they called psychotronics, to sort of weaponize human psychic ability. And they really became concerned that there was going to be this psychic Cold War. Now, it's not by accident that people like Alexander Parkhomov, are scientists who are studying relic neutrinos, because Parkhomov, when he retired from radiation research and cold fusion types of experiments, went into remote viewing, one of these KGB remote viewing programs, which he talks about in the Space, Earth, Human book, and discovered not only RV, but psychokinesis. So we were a little late to the game in the US, and the CIA, later DIA, different alphabet soup agencies had custodianship over this program, decided that there was a real threat here because just like, the Soviets had beat us with Sputnik, they might kind of beat us to the game with psychotronic research and could sort of use it in the Cold War. So they got Hal Puthoff on the left and Russell Targ on the right, who I've met many times at these international remote viewing conferences, and they got someone named Ingo Swann, said the same from New York. It was a New York City artist who had proved that he could. It wasn't just actually through remote viewing. He had done work with someone named Gertrude Schmeidler at the City College of New York, he found that he could affect the temperature of thermistors, these little devices that change their resistivity with temperature changes. He could affect them with his mind from across the room. And he wrote to Hal, finding out about this program at SRI, which is just new in the early 70s. He goes, I can do this naturally. He's actually from Telluride. I actually asked him when I talked to him once. He said, have you ever been there? I met him in 2013. Unfortunately, just 10 days before he passed on. I went down to his apartment. And I said, I've never been through there. He goes, one does not go through Telluride. I have not been. He was right. I looked at it. Actually, that's where Tesla did a lot of work. Kind of interesting little connection. In any case, Ingo went out to work at SRI. And the first thing that they had him do is Hal had him see if he could affect a quark detector, which was buried in the concrete at Stanford University, which the graduate students used for their dissertation experiments. And this thing, I am told, was shielded so many ways that not even a truck going right over it would create any vibrations, as some of you have heard this story probably now. And I've seen the outputs of the graphs. Normally this quark detector would have this kind of sinusoidal wave. And Hal showed us every time he asked Ingo to look at it, it stopped being a sine wave immediately. Hal said it was 100% proof that Ingo was affecting this device. And when they asked Ingo to describe it, he described it perfectly, even though it was buried a couple feet under concrete and had multiple shieldings, Faraday cages and things around it. Ingo not only drew it, but he was able to affect it with his mind. So the point about this is RV starts with PK, psychokinesis, both here with Ingo Swann and with other viewers. There was also Uri Geller, who you're familiar with. Before they had Ingo, actually, Uri came over, but he had to leave because of it was this secure facility, SRI, and he was there at Lawrence Livermore Lab. And I mentioned this in the previous talk last year, but when Uri was there doing the same things that Ingo later did, they didn't start with RV the way we know it now. It was looking at things in a box. They would hide things in a box. They'd say either to Uri and later, Ingo, what's in the box, And Uri, you can see this in Third Eye Spies, by the way, he was able to do it like 10 out of 10 times. Hits, no doubt, whatever they would put in there, he could, in his mind, describe it. But the interesting thing, and you can see this in the book by Jim Schnabel, Remote Viewers, when Uri was around at Lawrence Livermore Labs and SRI, the strange things would happen in the lab and around people that work with him, what we now call the hitchhiker effect. Whether it is a hitchhiker effect or not from the folks that worked in the OSAP program at Skinwalker, I think there are different explanations for that, but it goes back to Uri. And people saw little UFOs around Lawrence Livermore Lab. I mean, these are hardball scientists who didn't believe in these things, just like we heard this trucker a few minutes ago. I don't believe in those things. Those are those types of people. They saw these little classic UFOs floating through the lab. There were cryptids seen. There's this famous case where they were in a hotel and some really strange individual came in that almost seemed like a robot. Someone saw the arm floating the day before that this guy was seeing. Really strange stuff around here. You can read about these cases. People saw really strange birds that we don't know about at the end of their beds inside their homes. So before Skinwalker Ranch and James Lukatsky, Skinwalker's at the Pentagon, there was Uri Geller doing something. So this should give you a clue of what we're dealing with here, okay? It's not just portals out in the desert, or areas where they're hiding gilsonite or whatever causes those portal areas to be portals. There could be different reasons. It could be people like Uri. Well, why Uri? Well, he encountered an orb in his apartment complex. I think it was Tel Aviv, where he grew up. And he said his story was that it chased him, and he ran away from it, and it caught up with him, and he went unconscious. And when he came to again, he had these superpowers. And even someone like me, an academic, I think, is this real, or is this a good showmanship story? Well, one of his neighbors came forward not too long ago. I remember seeing them on TV and said they saw it from their balcony. You're as a teenager running away, or as a kid from this orb, as people are apt to do sometimes, and catching up with him. And so Ken, this sort of suggests to us that there are these commonalities with condensed matter systems that we don't understand very well, that again have to do with another state of matter that creates these non-local connections. Connections between levels of reality that we normally physically don't see, but we can see from experimental research, which I'll show you in a second actually exist. And then there was Nina Kaligina. Now this was one of the people that really scared the US defense establishment, because she could make things move around. You've probably seen these videos on YouTube of her manipulating things without touching them. They would put them in glass cages, and you can see rows of these serious Soviet scientists like watching her. And she could make things move around and apparently make things float. And apparently, from what I read, there are over 20 papers about her in CIA literature, because this is what they were concerned about, is these people might be able to bend tank barrels or, blow up your electronics at a distance. Again, this research was all sponsored by the KGB. That doesn't make it inherently sinister, since the KGB at the time was such a big component of Soviet society. I mean, I worked at this Soviet American Research Institute in 1989 in Luxembourg, Austria. I mean, and the KGB were like all over the place there, because they were just every time you had Soviet scientists abroad, they would have these miners around. You could tell who they were. So it's no surprise that they were doing this sort of research. At the same time, there was concern that people like this, could be used as a weapon. The interesting thing, what Nina said, and from observing how she did this, is she would be affected by things like thunderstorms, by weather. She was affected by these sort of environmental effects, which again should give us a clue to what sort of energies we're dealing with. She said that around thunderstorms, her abilities would go away. It was harder to do, and she'd be physically exhausted after doing some of these feats of manipulating things and making things float. And I can tell you, from having talked to someone who worked in the Pentagon during the time when she was doing this, that they were extremely concerned about this. I actually know of a case, and you may have heard me mention this before. I'm told by someone who was there were 30 men in a room observing a Soviet PK experiment in one of our intelligence agencies. And the sender of the PK energy was 1,000 miles away from Moscow, and their job, it could have been her, I don't know who the psychic was to bend a spoon 1,000 miles away, and I'm told that it bent on command. So you could see why they would want to create an American program in RV to kind of counter that. I asked this person why this wasn't released to the news. I mean, isn't this a kind of important news event? That they had proved, the US government had proved positive of psychokinesis, and I was told that you'll hear this from these sorts of people, that keeping sources and methods is so secret, keeping them secret is so important. They value that over public knowledge. And this is why you never heard about this event. So I have no doubt, if you look at Wikipedia, you'll see all these things, maybe how she was doing it, and magnets and things. Well, that is not the case, and I can tell you that directly from this person who was part of this observation team for Soviet PK experiments. They said it was real. In any case, we had our own experiments in this Princeton Anomalies Engineering Labs. In Princeton, this is micro PK. This is affecting our random number generator. You might have heard about these types of experiments, right? And an ordinary person like you or me, if you're ordinary like me in terms of psychic ability, you could affect the random number generator 2 or 3 events per 10,000 flips of the computer of zeros or ones, which is huge odds against chance of 375 trillion to 1. You could make it go more towards ones or zeros. It apparently was easier to make it go to 1 than to 0 for some reason. Normally you get that green line in the middle, that's just randomness, but it ceased to be random after thousands of trials. You can see the distribution of more towards ones or zeros for just average people. They also found that bonded pairs of people, partners, would affect the device more than people by themselves. Now, I saw an example of this in Japan when I was teaching RV there from 2005 through 8. One of my students who was a brain surgeon wanted me to see this place. And this person could melt and bend objects with his hands, make things float. These are Pepsi and Coke bottles that he was able to bend. These aren't the ones I saw, but I saw him do this. We couldn't take pictures while it was going on. I saw him bend, to take Coke bottles and turn them into a liquid right in front of me. He was able to do some sort of ESP experiments where he could draw something that you had drawn in advance, bend spoons, which look very decrystallized right around the edges there. He was able to take a mechanical wristwatch off of my wrist. I gave it to him. He said, I could break it. That's what I want you to know. And without touching the dial, he could make the hands spin around. How about that? Exactly as many minutes as he wanted. I saw this with my own eyes. The final thing he did, which shook me to the core, was make a cigarette float across the room into my shirt pocket. He was sitting about where you guys are, and he was standing where you guys are in the first row. And this would be like you'd pay for lunch and he would do the show for free. The actual local magicians union had taken him to court because they said it was unfair competition. And he had to change the name from, as they said, he was using real psychic powers and he was putting them out of business. So he would stand there behind where you would be, and from there, I saw him look at me. He was floating a cigarette over his hand. He could float PK notes and things like yen notes with this energy. And this cigarette came like a torpedo at me. This is one of the most shocking things I've ever seen in my life, believe me. It came right at me, right into the shirt pocket with force. And there's no magnets, no threads, no wires. I still have the cigarette. So the final thing I saw him twice, but I went back and talked to him, and he told me it took him 10 years to learn how to do this since he was a kid. I mean, it's a daily practice, like a martial art, to be able to harness what we believe are cold neutrinos, a human equivalent of these relic neutrinos, same wavelength, that you can emit from your fingers and your palms and so forth. In other words, we're all emitting these all the time, which is maybe why bonded pairs can affect the micro PK devices at Princeton, because there's an exchange of energy, and it's a physical energy that you're exchanging. I do think it was a physical energy because he said, roll up your sleeve, and he didn't touch my arm. He ran it over my arm like this, and it was like freaking electricity down way deep in the bone. I could feel it. It's exactly what Tesla said he experienced around some of his machines. He said it was like pins and needles. Kind of rang a bell in my head when I read that. It's exactly what I felt. And Tesla called it radiant energy. I think it's all the same thing. But in any case, back to RV for a moment. There were other people that were really good at this who joined the program. One was Pat Price, you can see in the middle here, and here he is on the right. And Pat was able to do some, really amazing things like, I'll show you some of his drawings in a second, but he actually worked on the Patricia Hearst case for the sheriff of San Francisco. He was able to identify the getaway car when they asked him. They did send a deputy out to find exactly where he said it was, and the ringleaders from a mug book of 300 people. He said, give me a mug book. They called SRI, can you help with the Hearst case? And he opened it up, that's him, and it was Sinju, we're told, the ringleader for the whole thing. So he had these amazing abilities. He had been a police chief in Burbank, California, and it said that when he was police police commissioner, I think it was. He would send squad cars out to places before the crimes were even committed. And the crime rate was very low in Burbank when he was involved with the police. In any case, you can see Hal put off here on the left side of the photo. Now, Hal's has come out with patents recently. After he left the RV program and turned it over to Ed May in 1985, he's created several companies where he lives in Texas, and they have to do with communication systems with submarines and other ways to use communications without electromagnetic signals, zero electromagnetic signals. So I've been looking over these patents, and it's just fascinating that the person who was involved with Ingo Swann and Pat Trice and Uri Geller went on to create non-ordinary communication systems that don't use any signal whatsoever. They only use resonance, like we were talking about at the beginning. What's called vector and scalar potential. And there are several patents here. So the system uses field-free potentials. They work despite seawater, plasma, or other dense media. In other words, they work without, it doesn't matter what's in the way between the sender and the receiver. And this is known, non-electromagnetic signals like this are known as the Aharonov-Bohm Effect. And I think we can say safely that if the person who ran the RV program is filing patents in the Aharonov-Bohm Effect, that's probably what's creating an RV too. The Aharonov-Bohm Effect is one of these spooky quantum principles where if you take a particle and you send it around in a circular orbit around a magnet, a solenoid, or magnetic whiskers, as they say, and you activate the whiskers of the solenoid so that all of the magnetism is completely contained within a cylinder. There is zero outside. You take your tri-field meter, magnetometer, you're not going to pick up anything. It's still going to affect the particle because it's in what's called vector or scalar potential energy. These are numbers in the quantum equations that you can't see them, you can't feel them, but quantum mechanics tells us their potential energy, that they're there. And the Aharonov-Bohm effect tells us that it's real. It can affect the phase of a particle. It can affect the position of particles, even though there's zero electromagnetic energy. So for those of you that have been looking at UFOs and like myself going to crop circle country and measuring, it's not in traditional EM fields. You're not going to find, you may find the correlates of that, but this is not where the main action's happening. It's happening in this other realm of quantum energy. It's really a quantum effect. This is not just using words for the sake of sounding cool. It's a real interesting quantum effect. New Scientist said this is one of the top 7 quantum effects ever. It was postulated in the early 50s by engineers before Aharonov and Bohm. And they didn't know what it was, and they weren't theorists, so they sort of forgot about it. But Aharonov and Bohm recognized them later. Ehrenberg and C. Day, who discovered this first. And then it was proved in 1986 by a fellow named Tanomura in Japan. So these are it's 30 years from speculating. This is David Bohm, by the way, you've probably heard of him, who talks about the implicate quantum order and so forth. Bohm, the Broglie effect, pilot waves and so forth, other interpretations of quantum mechanics. It can take 30 years from an idea to actually finding the experimental evidence. So this is what's the interesting thing is, there's a whole video on YouTube you can watch. I encourage you to take a look at this video if this is even remotely interesting to you. The physics of UFOs, Eric Weinstein and Hal Puthoff. Again, I learned about this from Bob Greenyer at MFMP on the Jesse Michaels channel. This is fascinating because it's all about how do we explain all of these weird, spooky effects around all these phenomena, including the trucker case we heard about earlier from Seth and Anniversary, where you get these orbs, you get these flashes of light, you get sudden temperature changes. This is all indicative of Aharonov-Bohm type effects. And you can listen to this, how do we neutralize gravity? How do UFO propulsion systems work? So basically, Hal, and he's open about this, has talked to us about being part of these UFO programs for Department of Defense, for OSAP, and I guess other intelligence agencies as well, which he can't talk about. But he gave us a presentation in 2018 in Vegas for IRVA SSE, and he talked about working in OSAP and being the science director and attempting to figure out how the metamaterials from the hulls of these craft create their own propulsion with no fuel, how they act like waveguides, how it changes the fundamental space-time metric, which is one reason why so many of these paranormal phenomena look fuzzy. They are fuzzy because they're literally changing how light moves. This is why it's very hard to take pictures of this, including, in many cases in our own state, Bigfoot. Why do those photos often look so blurry? The skeptics will say, everyone's got iPhones now. How come we don't have tons of video? It's because these objects are blurry because there's variation in the fundamental space-time metrics, permittivity, permeability. You can watch this video and learn more about that, but it's fascinating. So Hal has his own designs for creating a Aharonov-Bohm effect for communications, and I'm just going over this because I'm pretty much assuming that if the person that ran the RV program is creating patent after patent in the Aharonov-Bohm effect for communications, this probably has a lot to do with how someone can do RV. It's a simple principle of resonance in the classical sense. Is if you have a tuning fork here at one frequency and you hit it, the other tuning fork will spontaneously ring. And that's sort of an analogy of how we could communicate at a distance with something that seems far away, is because there's actually a frequency connection and they sort of resonate together, So, now other people have talked about this, and this is where it gets into this sort of other reality, this other universe, a dark universe that we can't see and measure easily, but all the experiments like the Aharonov-Bohm effect tell us that they're there. Like Boyd Bishman from Lockheed, who talked about another universe that he called the neutrino universe. Could be relic neutrinos, could be other types of neutrinos. These really tiny, tiny particles. Other types of neutrinos. And he talks about dark matter. And basically we're just starting to understand how we interact with this other universe where there's a lot going on, but it doesn't interact with us directly. There's this patent I mentioned in the previous talk last year by Lockheed Martin in coherent matter wavebeams. And if you look at this patent, systems and methods for generating coherent matter wavebeams, it's all about using the Aharonov-Bohm effect for cloaking, invisibility, directed energy weapons, basically how to affect things at a distance with zero energy, frequency, and resonance. Right in the second page, they say this is like murmurations of birds or flocks of fish, where you have a group of particles or a group of birds or fish, and they all kind of act like a wave. And you've seen these murmurations of birds, especially in this part of the country. I just saw a lot driving back to New York to visit my mom through Kansas and Missouri, tons of these huge murmurations. I keep thinking about this patent. That's a kind of an analogy to what you can do. It's not just with what's called the Bose-Einstein condensate, which was discovered at NIST down the road in Boulder, where everything's cooled, and you've heard about this, cool it to ultra low temperatures, and it starts acting like all the particles act like a flock of birds or, school of fish or something, swarm of bees. They all kind of act together coherently. In the Lockheed Martin patent, they say we can do this at any temperature with any particles. We can do it with electrons too, and they even, in patents you have to show how you're going to do what you claim to be able to do. They have this resonating chamber where you take particles and they go through and they all end up at the same frequency and the same temperature, and they're all resonating together, and you've got coherent wavebeams. You can affect weather with this, you can make things become invisible, and all sorts of interesting military applications. That's why Lockheed Martin's involved. But it's not just a modern thing. Even James Clerk Maxwell's idea of electromagnetism had this sort of vortices, these vortexual sort of cells that he had in his drawings for electromagnetism. And we know that vortices can create a lot of interesting electromagnetic effects. It even goes back before Maxwell. If you go back to 1846, there's someone who was a very important part of physics, as I learned just recently from André Torres Assis. Wilhelm Weber proposed that if you have particles really close together, you would, closer than 10 to the negative 15th meters. Any sort of particles really close. And this is just using Newtonian mechanics. This is way before quantum mechanics. He said you were going to get negative inertial mass. Negative inertial mass being all sorts of weird types of things where the properties are opposite of what we're used to in our ordinary reality. So that rather than just this principle that we've all grown up with, that light charges repel, right? And that you put electrons together and the Coulombic force, any particles push them apart again. There's another attractive force in the universe that when things get very close together, they can become bosonic, they can become coherent. That's what the Lockheed Martin patent is talking about. But even someone like Wilhelm Weber in 1846, 25 years before Maxwell's electromagnetics, is proposing that you're going to get interesting and exotic effects just using Newtonian principles from things that are very close together. They're not going to behave in an ordinary way. If you look up negative inertial mass, you're going to see it's related to things like the Alcubierre warp drive and interesting exotic principles like that. So you can trace this back well before Tesla. Even John Wheeler, Princeton, Hugh Everett III's thesis advisor and advisor to many other physicists that we know about, saw this sort of toroidal magnetic shape that he called a geon, which he thought would create its own gravitational force right through the center. And those are electromagnetic structures lined up in a toroidal shape. And this sort of toroidal shape, if you put it in a structure that's inward facing and fractal, you can create really interesting electromagnetic effects. This is from the work of Zhvirblis and Nebesky in Soviet Union and Russia later in the 90s, who created or observed, Zhvirblis observed, lab-created ball lightning in some Moscow KGB experiment, which he originally thought had to be a hoax, because when they turned off the equipment, the orb stayed there in the same position. When they removed the equipment, the orb stayed over the table floating. And he said it would stay there for 2 days if you didn't touch it. He called it an electromagnetic phantom. Does this sound very familiar to the types of things that we see in the phenomena that we study, orbs and UFOs and UAP, where there seems to be a luminosity that doesn't have any physical structure to it, but it's a self-sustaining ball lightning. This is the structure of lab-created ball lightning. And so the basis of it is a sort of fractal Maxwellian structure, extending Maxwell's equations, which are normally at 90 degrees, moving outward. This is sort of an inward-facing electromagnetism that goes all the way down, according to these two authors, Zhvirblis and Nebesky, all the way down to the zero-point field. If you take the sort of 90-degree angles, but you put them in toroidal shapes, rings upon rings upon rings, you end up with this fractal structure, which they thought was the basis for electromagnetic phantoms, lab-created ball lightning. Orbs that could sustain themselves for days without any power source. And some of these Russian researchers said they could get these orbs to sustain themselves for weeks, especially if they embedded themselves in metal and had an electron source. So these toroidal moments, and again, this comes from Bob Greenyer and MFMP, is really important. It goes back to research from the Soviet Union again, Zeldovich in 1950s, later Dubovik. So again, you can see why we fell behind in the psychotronic space race, okay? Because the Soviets were studying this and had figured it out starting in the 50s. It's probably why their electronics was superior to American electronics for quite a long while, even if the whole political system was incredibly corrupt. And and it fell in on itself eventually in the early 90s. But the science was really quite advanced, and we're still catching up to it. You'll hear Hal Puthoff say in that interview with Jesse Michaels, because they ask him, where did all this science go in the US? How come we're not talking about this? Why don't we have these technologies? And what Hal says there is pretty much exactly what he said to me when I asked him. It either didn't work or it went black. So the experiments didn't work, and if it worked, we're not hearing it anymore because it's in some classified program within DOD or DOE. And it's just like when I asked this person from the defense establishment about that case of witnessing PK remotely in the Soviet Union, they value the secrecy over public education. So this is sort of the situation where we don't understand the UFO, UAP phenomenon very well, is because it's all gone deep black. Don't believe me, you can hear Hal talk about it, someone who's worked in those programs. He can't say very much, but he's been able to tell us that. So here's toroidal forms. I think this has a lot to do with how RV could work, because if you get these so-called phase singularities, these are structures that have intense EM fields inside, but they don't radiate anything outside. You're not going to pick up anything with your tri-field meter or your magnetometer. Believe me, I've tried many times in crop circles to pick up an EM signature there. It's internal to the structure itself. It's called a phase singularity. It neutralizes EM fields outside. And you can see in these graphs here, this is from the work of Paranormal, where it just drops off right in the middle. So this is what we're talking about, is systems that don't have any of this ordinary EM energy that we're all so familiar with from all our devices and that we see around, in light and so forth. These are radiating fields. What we're talking about here is another type of EM field which is totally self-contained, but has non-local connections through Aharonov-Bohm or something like this to every other point in the universe. That's why David Bohm called it the implicate order, holography, holonomy, and there's different names for this. I did that every point is sort of connected to every other point. So it's sort of like the inverse of this direct space. William Tiller, who I got to hear lecture a number of times at IRVA, called it a reciprocal space compared to direct space. And back when I listened to Bill Tiller talking about this, I just wondered, is this really true, or is this a science model? It really seems to be true based on all of these types of experiments, because this is what creates orbs. Paranormal was able to create orbs just with a Mobius strip. This Mobius strip, something, I was always interested in this in high school, like a folded piece of paper and one end is twisted back, and it's sort of, you can go on both the inside and the outside without ever leaving the loop. Mobius strips are something that's actually like what M.C. Escher was talking about. Because when I looked at this M.C. Escher, remember that M.C. Escher art book that you probably looked at as a kid? I used to look at this in high school. This is not just artwork. This is actually the basis for generating orbs. M.C. Escher, they call it a horizontal subspace. It's like you're going up the stairs, but you're never getting anywhere. And that's the basis of energy in a toroidal form. It's just going around active donuts. This is going around the donut loop colloidally around the donut. It's actually never going up, but it seems like it's going somewhere, and that's what creates these weird effects. So if you look right here, my arrow's a little off. We've all seen these sort of orbs, maybe ball lightning, heard examples of this, people spontaneously encountering orbs. It's produced in labs, Tesla, so forth. But you also get black ball lightning. With John Ramirez, who has talked about this, John Ramirez, the missile analyst from the CIA, who's talked on different podcasts recently, called it stealth plasma. It's a whole nother type of matter that doesn't even reflect light. It can be invisible too, which is maybe what Katsky's writing about at Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, these sort of dark shapes they encountered, which they could never figure out what they were. And Ken Shoulders, who was one of Hal Puthoff's colleagues, by the way, at SRI, but he was working in, from what we know, it was classified research had to do with electronics and electronic masking, and it's in all of our phones now, by the way. but he's the guy that invented how to put electronics together on circuit boards and stuff for the US government. This is what he said about it. These black EVs seem to lack states that couple to our region of normal permittivity. They create their own superconductivity. They sort of exist in their own cocoon. It's like a life form that exists in a different phase space, in our physical space, but it's in its own sort of energetic state due to changes in permittivity and permeability and so forth. And anyway, you can create these. I mean, whoever thought of a Mobius strip could create cool orbs like this. But this is, when you look at all these things shooting, what is all this stuff coming off to the sides? You know, it's strange. It's like another life form. So people that work with this are familiar with what is going on here, but the rest of us are catching up. And again, I think before we look at how RV works, I think this has a lot to do with it. And this is a pretty good introduction to all these subjects. Cold electricity, you know, as Ken Shoulders called these orbs black organizations with ghostly properties. He's talking about charge clusters here, folks. He's not talking about any conspiracy theory. This is what he's referring to as exotic vacuum objects, charge clusters, what we call static electricity. When you sustain it, those little sparks you see on your sheets or you get from your dog or you know, touch a doorknob, when you can sustain those, you create this whole other type of energy and structure. And it's related to all of these subjects: cold electricity, invisible or black ball lightning, sudden short circuits, electrical failure, you know, the car that and the engine stalls right when the UFO's nearby. It also happens around cryptids and Bigfoot if you read the literature, that just when you want to get away, it doesn't start. It'll start again, but not until they leave. Read enough cases of that, it can, you know, give you a heart attack right there. Power surges, I've seen that in crop circles, blowing out cameras and equipment. The stuff had to be resoldered, sent back to the factory. Non-local signals, hello. Magnetization of non-magnetic materials. This is the hallmark of these orbs and ball lightning and, of course, UFOs and UAP. Aports. This is also something they found around Uri Geller when they were working at SRO. Aports would show up, things that had been missing would fall out of the sky. You can read about it in Schnabel's book. One of Russell Targ's lapel pins and something. And they found one in an ice cream that they bought at the beach, and the other fell out in the air. And he had been missing them for months, and Yuri said he could find them, and there they are. So, dark matter life forms, shadow biome, as Northrop Grumman calls it, and different types of some UFO, UAP activity. Now, I have another example where I heard about some classified event, which I was able to get from someone who worked in the defense establishment, and I wrote about this in Dark Matter Monsters. There was a case in Kansas in the 60s where there was a total collapse of an electromagnetic field around one town. For 24 hours, one town completely lost all electromagnetic function. Everything stopped working, including watches, regular batteries. And this was being observed by the Department of Defense at a distance. And that is an example, I think, of what we're talking about here, is it can spontaneously show up in your life. You know, all the power's gone. I mean, it's not like the electricity went down. We're talking about the structural electromagnetism ceased for a while in one area in the US. You know, they would be concerned about this. Parkhomov, in Space Earth Human, writes about this. Cases of bolides and objects coming over apartment complexes that temporarily gravity was reversed for a few seconds and everything hit the ceiling in those apartments. In some cases, the buildings temporarily lifted off the ground. The authorities would say something like it was a natural gas explosion, but people said the effects happened even before there was any sound or anything like that. A little bathtub water hit the ceiling, something like that. So this could be cases where there's just fluctuations in the space-time that occur because we're part of a cosmological system. It just could be natural, or in the Kansas case, perhaps there's a UFO nearby or something, you know. So these sorts of things happen. Now, how does that relate to what we're talking about here? we have these toroidal shapes, this sort of fractal electromagnetism built into us, into our bodies. In this article by Raybould, he talks about fruit flies have this donut-shaped structures in their brains, which seems to give them the ability to detect Earth's magnetic field. Something that you and I can't do without, a compass or something. Fruit flies can do it. Obviously, birds can detect magnetic fields of the Earth, and they do it through these toroidal structures that are sort of built into their perception. Even this recent article suggests that human brains have these phase singularities built in. In this particular article, they call it the vortex of the cortex. Again, I'm suggesting, and you might not agree with this, but I'm suggesting this links us to this other type of quantum world of non-local information. Mysterious brain signals spotted in the human brain. This was recognized through functional MRI, which looks at, I think, magnetic components within blood. I think that there's something injected or something that they can detect these magnetic fluctuations in your body. So phase singularities are part of what makes our brain work for reasons we'll probably be interested in for a long time. Is that what's responsible for RV? I don't know. It's possible. The RV is something that happens through your whole body. So it's not just in the brain, but this is something that connects our biology to these topics I was just talking about, these toroidal shapes. So let's just look at some RV sessions and see how this works, since that's really what we're focusing on. I just wanted to give you that background because, and I've never given this presentation before, I wanted to show you that RV is not something that just sits by itself. It seems to be part and parcel of these other types of phenomena because they're based on the same sort of fundamental principles. So I showed you Pat Price before. Here's some examples of work that he did. He was viewing the Soviet research site. This is one of the huge gantry cranes. It's a little person there that the CIA artist drew, and he was able to reproduce it in his sketches, you can see. He was able to go inside some of these buildings and see big metal structures shaped like orange peels to contain these chemical lasers that they later found several years later. He actually passed away before they got all the feedback, but what he drew here on the right was very similar. So that's the level of accuracy you can get with RV. Joe McMonagle, you've probably heard of him. He was able to locate something like 15 out of 18 missing people for the Japanese police from his home in Virginia, just with their name. And he described to us how he did it. He would sort of imagine he was coming from above and see these land-water interfaces, and then look for a building intersection streets and kind of hone in, and he would give the police their apartment number, and they would be there. People who had lost their memory or been abducted or something like this. So just really incredible accuracy. I mean, down to the apartment number. It's really good if you can do that. So here's an example of what he could do just with a sort of, these pictures would be hidden ahead of time. And if you want to stick around later, we'll practice this a little bit. This is what we do. We kind of take a picture. Well, I won't hide it in a folder here, but you get the idea. I mean, here's this Swiss mountain scene, and there's this very good reproduction of it. And these are blind targets. So there's really no way to cheat. It's not like anyone can give you any information. Practical application, he was asked to view this huge, structure near one of the Soviet oceans up there where they had a naval building, and he said that this submarine, he described the submarine, they thought it was an aircraft carrier, but he said no, it's a submarine with the missiles ahead of the conning tower. There had never been a submarine with the missiles ahead of the conning tower. And like 6 weeks later, there it came out. They put it in the water. So this is what you could do with these practical applications of it. This is Lawrence Livermore Lab. He was given this as a target. You can see he got the rows of trees. It's very accurate sessions. This is, why he's working for the U.S. government, why the program continued for 20 years. You've heard, it was canceled because it didn't work. I don't think so. Not if you can do this. Look at the building, The person, this was an outbounder session. They send someone and they say to Joe, or wherever it is, if it's you sitting in the room back where you are, describe where the outbounder is. And this is what Joe was able to describe. They were actually in this building at the time. So just some of the documents showing you, it's still redacted. These are, RV was taken seriously, especially Soviet or Chinese RV, or psychotronic functioning, as it was called. And in all these cases, it just thought it was a threat. I mean, this is how the defense establishment saw it. And this is why I think they just did it, because they felt it could be compromise, communication, security. China had many institutes. There's a book by Paul Dong called China's Super Psychics or something like that. You can look at that if you want. They had extensive programs on this, and they could do just amazing things. I mean, you can look at what the target was, what the person, if this is what it, if these are actual sessions, how they were able to reproduce letters and things, actual words, psychics in China. Like, this would be what was sent, and that's what was received. It's sort of similar to what I saw the guy in Japan do, which, again, challenges our sense. How could it be that accurate that you could literally see in your mind's eye? But probably some people have more toroidal shapes in their brains than others, and they're better at picking this up. In any case, when you look at our reaction of our defense establishment, it's initially all about these threats from Soviet PSP and PK and so forth, threat to ComSec and communication security. And there was someone here who you probably know, I forgot his name from the previous meeting, who said he worked doing the counterintelligence for the US Army program down in Colorado Springs. So, because this was a special access program too. So it's just sort of funny for those of us who've been involved with this to see all these declassified documents, just remote viewing, telepathy, clairvoyance, defensive blocking, just how seriously this was taken. So anytime you hear that, it was just canceled in 95 because it didn't work or something, I mean, not if you look at these documents, it doesn't look like that was the case at all. It looks like someone took this very seriously and wanted to figure out how we could do it too. Now, when I teach it, when I'm involved with it, it's nothing to do with defense or anything. It's about your own security as a person and understanding how you work. What awareness do you have that you don't even know you have? That's why I still do this. I've taught this in Japan, and this is typically what our written sessions look like. You have a protocol. We use a written protocol, the protocol that Ingo invented called CRV, Coordinate Remote Viewing. And it's sort of a set of stages. You end up getting written information eventually. Like, this is a double-blind session, so nobody knows what this is ahead of time. And this is the target picture, and that's what the viewer was able to do. This particular woman, Lorraine, was a former Olympic marathon runner. And she can do these drawings that look a lot like on some of these ones we've seen here. Just reproduce it, kind of astounding. It's double blind, which means even the monitor doesn't know what the target is ahead of time. But the accuracy of this never ceases to astound us, anyone who was involved with this, where they can reproduce something they haven't seen yet. The information is coming across the transom. There's the target picture, and there's a lot of similarities to people going down one of these land sleds, and you can see these arrows. They draw these arrows going across. They don't see the target picture for maybe 15, 20 minutes, an hour later. This is one we just did on Thursday. I'm teaching an intermediate class by Zoom. The target was Wright Brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk. And this person just kept getting this kind of airplane shape. They drew it several times, but I have to get it off of the video. It's a video shot, it's not really clear, but you can see they got this airplane. There it is, Even the canard at the front has that shape, Anyway, it's always just amazing to see people at other scales. It works this kind of large scale. There's Mars, and there's that, big canyon, and they sort of draw it. And it's not like they're given any information ahead of time. It's pretty much the same monitoring protocols every time. Colors, senses, shapes, patterns. You just learn not to edit anything out. It's almost as if you cancel out electromagnetic fields that we're normally used to, or you ignore them, you calm your mind down, this subtler layer of information is already there. And we're all familiar with this from just gut feelings we get about people and situations and places that turn out to be accurate. Where you knew something ahead of time, you don't know how you know it, but you sort of trust it. RV is really sort of the same thing. So it really seems like this is already built into us. And the RV is just taking that ability we have and honing it in a little bit. Yeah. Sure. Let me just finish up this section. I'll send a couple more here and then we'll just a few more. So, when you're getting these, you don't even believe yourself, which is why the person writes on the side, they can doubt themselves. This was, some of you know Ron Russell, might have been at some of these meetings. This is one of his targets, race car, So anyway, you kind of get the feeling of what these can look like. The target could be anything, and this is just for practice, but you can see these are just beginners. And here's the final one I'll show before we go to break. Leaning Tower Pisa. Now here's why this is interesting. This is the picture from this angle, and the viewer draws it from the side. They get mountains there, which you can't see, but if you've ever been there or if you looked at pictures, there literally are these hills. So this shows us, what does it show us? They're not just describing the feedback picture, they're getting information that's at the site that we can't see in the picture, but is actually there. Okay, so before we go to do some practice, let's take a little break and we'll come back. If you want to do it, come back and we'll try it. Okay. Well, guys, you've been very kind listening to all of that. It was a lot of information. That's like 25 years of information in about an hour. I know that was a lot, but it's kind of cool that things come together after 25 years. And imagine being involved with remote viewing, what I call resonant viewing, for 25 years and it never really comes to anything. Like you don't really know anymore after 25 years about why it works than quarter century ago. And it's kind of cool that it converged to these other topics, and of course other people have done research into it. And honestly, what we're dealing with here in the US is we have an entire level of science that's in special access programs. So I think it's what Hal says in that video, if you watch it, if it works, then it goes black. That's what we're dealing with here. That's why the whole thing feels so dumbed down. Why we know so little. You know people who've encountered Bigfoot, right? And cryptids. You probably know someone. Why don't we talk about it? What's wrong with sharing stories like some of you did during the break? There's a gap that I don't personally feel is really healthy for any society to have. So this is why I study these things. But before we go on and do some practice, I wanted to show you. Yes, I wanted to show you a couple pictures of non-verifiable targets. Yeah, UFOs that we viewed. But does anyone have any questions before we just briefly? It is getting later. We don't want to keep you here forever, but any questions? Yeah, because that was a lot of information.
So I wanted to go back to Uri Geller. He had no memory at all of his childhood encounter until he was hypnotized by Hunter Harwich.
Oh, interesting. That's interesting.
Is there any room for hypnosis in your research for remote viewing?
I work with hypnotherapists because they're interested in RV, and they've taken my classes. And the first classes I did out in Salt Lake City in '99 was with a hypnotherapy school. And I had 100% people who were doing training to learn how to do hypnosis. And it's been a lot of fun going to some of their parties where they do this. It's always amazing to see people change and become what the suggestion is, But I haven't used it personally, but it's a good question. And it's related to this because we're talking about going below what we call the limit, the threshold of consciousness. But thanks for sharing that about Yuri. I didn't know that was just recovered that way. But it's interesting though, isn't it, that there was a witness? Yeah.
His superpowers were, I guess, turned up in the duration that he was doing hypnosis with Andre Clark.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that information. Yeah. So the interesting thing again about Yuri is so much of what he said. There's always these skeptics. You know, they're not even skeptics, scoffers. You're familiar with these people. He seems to write the bulk of these Wikipedia pages. It's just the tone is so negative. Like this couldn't possibly be true, which is what it's always been said about anything that was new, including the Wright brothers. So I mean, it usually turns out to be true. But if you look at Yuri, the commonalities between his experience and others. That's what's really fascinating. Go ahead.
So about the ball lightning.
Yes.
The last time I remember reading about ball lightning, mainstream science still wasn't sure whether it was real or not. So I was wondering, if the lab-created ball lightning and these Russian experiments, has that been replicated by anyone?
Mm-hmm. Yes. There are 2 Air Force papers on ball lightning, 93 and 2003. One was by Eric Davis, who you're familiar with, right? Worked with Jacques Vallée and Wilson Davis notes. He's the author of one of the ball lightning papers. You can read Bitchkov from Russia. Just look up Alexander Kuhl, Keul, online. He has a whole historical survey of ball lightning. Just because it's rare doesn't mean that it's not there. And there's even, there's been spectrographical analysis of the light of ball lightning, which shows that it's the same thing that's being of natural ball lightning. That shows it's the same thing that's being produced in labs. Anything else? Any other questions? These are good questions, by the way. There's no bad questions here. It's a big subject matter, and we haven't heard very much about it. Yeah.
I did want to make a comment that the Earth is a super powerful electromagnetic generator. You know, it protects us from everything. So just the Earth itself generates a lot of electromagnetic energy. So I see that as a potential source of ball lightning, combined with different geology or, what's in the ground. So
yeah, there are people who proposed, Marcia Adams proposed using infrared satellites to detect ball lightning over mountain ranges to predict earthquakes. And she suggested this to the U.S. government as an earthquake prediction technique, is looking for ball lightning from satellites because it seems to be appear above mountain ranges from tectonic plate motion generates electromagnetic energy. It's a whole fascinating subject. We could do a whole other lecture on ball lightning because there's so many misconceptions, but yeah, it's produced in the lab. Thunderstorms, 70%, 30% no thunderstorms. I've talked to people who've encountered it. Sometimes it'll knock you on your butt when it blows up, and sometimes it just goes right through things. I mean, it's really strange.
What would be the effect of the Schumann resonance on any kind of remote viewing?
That's always been a good question, and I don't have the answer. We need to do some experimental research, seeing as that shift, like sidereal time, would that affect our viewing? But I think we've established the idea that RV is related to electromagnetism, not directly, but in the way we've seen through electromagnetic potentials. So there's some physical component, so you'd imagine it would have some effect, right? But in any case, we'll do some more questions at the end. Let's go on and do some practice. And I just want to give you a feel for what this is like. I wanted to show you one more thing. People have used ARV to make money. RV, it's called ARV. Both Hal Puthoff and Russell Tarr did this as demonstrations. Russell made, I think, a couple 100,000. I spoke to people who were in his spook group. You just basically get objects and assign one market up and mark down, and the next day you show the person the object that corresponds with the market did. But you have someone view the day before what object are you going to be shown. And if it describes mark it up, you make a prediction that's mark it up. We did it 10 out of 10 times correctly with the S&P 500 in Boulder with play money. And Hal did it, he made like $20,000 for a local school or something. I got 21 out of 30 right. People who do ARV tend to get about 70% correct, 30 wrong. And I'm just showing you this guy, Greg Kolajic, did a 13-year experiment by himself, solo, where he both was the viewer and the judge of his own sessions. With like a 65% hit rate, he made, I think, $146,000, which he didn't think was as much as his job. So he says it's not a great way to make money, compared to the amount of time it takes, but he just was proving that RV is real. If RV isn't real, he would not get 70-30. Even the Wall Street Journal had an article about Russell Tart's spookery. So that's another aspect of this that shows us RV definitely, you're viewing the future. It's subtle, but you're getting the information. So I just wanted to show you a couple more of these, and then we'll do some practice sessions. Just small little sessions to show you. This was the first crop circle I encountered as an RV session. This is why I got interested in crop circles. Triple Juliet Windmill Hill, and this is my RV session. You can do it on these non-verifiable targets. I mean, it was kind of interesting. Energy in a circle. There's no front loading here. This is a blind target, but I got some circle with energy going in now. This is what got me curious in crop circles, was this particular target. That's the base 4 matrix. It's a little more advanced. So we can do it on these types of targets for fun. These are balls of light, orbs that someone saw next to us in the UK. These are not verifiable. Those targets I showed you before the break are verifiable targets. These are just to see what you get. This person got something that looked like an orb to me. I mean, again, no front loading, and energy. You may want to go over and visit these locations later to get your feedback. I started going over to the UK just to get feedback on that Windmill Hill session. It was the only way it's supposed to. And I went back year after year with Ron and ended up, doing the tours after he stopped doing them, and been back there about 20 times. That's where I saw the camera and battery failure and all these weird EM type effects, which, led to these other interests. But anyway, we can do it on UFOs, and people get these UFOs they draw UFOs, you know what I'm saying? And it's what the target is. Now, can we prove anything from this? Not quite. We can move them inside the vehicle. We can have them describe what they see inside. I think Travis Walton described the chair, didn't he? Yeah. It's probably in Barry's book. But if you haven't read Barry's UFO book, it's quite good. You should take a look. Phoenix lights. It's interesting to do these, but we can't verify it at the end of the day because the UFO is gone. It's just for practice, but I think it's fun to do this. This was an underground base that Roger Lear asked us. Remember Roger Lear with the implants? He said there's a suspicious thing near my home. Is it an underground facility? Well, our viewer got it. It was an underground facility. He told me Raytheon or whoever it was in Simi Valley, and they got a covert and sensitive base. I didn't say anything to them. So I went back to Roger and said, yeah, we got a base. Free energy machine stuff. So this is fun, non-verifiable. One final thing I'll show you, and then we'll do some practice with simple, non-UFO verifiable targets.
Hey, Simeon, just a quick question. I've read also that human-made crop circles would have similar effects as non-human-made, allegedly, crop circles.
That's what we found, Mary. That was the biggest surprise to me. When I went over there with Ron, we didn't know who was making them. We didn't know what they were doing. We just know there were these weird effects around them. And eventually we started running into people that said we can make them, and we didn't believe them. But we went out with them at night, and that's what my book, Opening Minds, is about. There's some copies back there if you want to take one home. And they really were good. Ron and I couldn't believe it. But then the weirdest thing was our cameras and batteries kept failing around the ones they made. Then we started making some. We made one in Hays, Kansas on the way back from the 2002 IRVA conference. We had permission to make a small one. And every single picture is weird lights going across. It's on my website. I can point you to it if you're interested. I just stopped in Hays on the way driving through there recently, made a little update video. But the point is, what you're saying is true, Barry, and that's what we found. It's the shape of the formation. I have met people who've seen UFOs crush meadow plants as the craft floated over. I've talked to these people. There's no doubt that UFOs affect plant material. The propulsion systems or whatever metamaterials are, it's affecting the plants. But people imitated that and started making a lot of those in the 80s and 90s. And those ones still affected our cameras and batteries, which showed us that the ETs taught us something new. How to affect our cameras and batteries with planes, right?
Yeah,
What's wrong with that?
It was so bizarre. Like why? Like you said, maybe it's a shape.
Yeah, no, shade, face, singularity, spirals, similar sorts of effects. So this, just one quick one. Someone sent us this picture who had worked in the government to test us. We don't do any work with the government. We haven't so far. But sometimes we've been contacted and we've been given test targets by people who are associated with some of these agencies just to see if we're any good. So this is Groom Lake, Area 51 hangars. You can see the MiGs in front of the hangars. I called a viewer, hypnotherapist from that 99 class, Terry in Salt Lake. I have a target for you. Here's the coordinates. Hang on. Nothing. Just targets. Would you like to do it? And this is what she was able to draw. Look how similar it is. Even the planes. And it was a 10-second phone conversation with coordinates. That was it. You know, I nearly fell out of my chair. It was like, is there a camera in my room or something? How is she doing this? Well, I always wonder how people are doing that. I think we have a better idea. Resonance, but that's how accurate it can be. So, we did some questions a few minutes ago. So let's do a little practice. So you all have some paper? Because you can all do this. It's not...
You need paper. You can see Rich, maybe a writing utensil, but you're going to need that for the...
Someone came up during the break and shared a really cool Ingo story. They met him in the 70s, and they were at a party. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you told me the story. They put something in the basement for him and surrounded it in lead. What was your name again? Jody. And they surrounded it in lead, and he described it perfectly. Was it an object, a physical object? Yeah, so that's it. So she got to meet Ingo. We're very lucky. And so we're not all of us are Ingos, but we can all do something, and it's probably more than you thought you could do. So I created a simple protocol to be able to teach you in 5 minutes how to do RV. This sort of condensed written system. And I'm just going to show you how to do this, and it's pretty simple. First thing is to just relax a little bit when you do a session, cool down, calm the conscious mind down. Calm the EM fields. You can take pictures of any of this, it's fine. Usually a bit of a cool down. Then the Ingo system is to draw something called an ideogram. It's sort of an unconscious movement that your hand makes. It's not like a drawing of the target. It's just a squiggle, basically, but we can decode the squiggle. There's information in the squiggle. It's like hologram idea, so it's ideogram. So you let your hand move and draw the squiggle. It's your unconscious mind telling you something about the information about the target, but we don't know what it is. It's just a squiggle. We decode it. We touch it a little bit. We get some basic impressions. Hard, soft, wet, dry, smooth, rough. Then we get some sensory information, colors, taste, smells, temperatures, textures. It's and this is in a nutshell what CRV is. It's letting the aperture open up to this other world where you can perceive the target with your non-local sensory apparatus. It starts out with very basic information in it, like a keyhole opening up. Also, you see a little more. So you go from sensories to dimensions, shapes, and patterns. What you're doing here is just writing down what's coming to your mind. You're not second guessing yourself. You're simply writing it down. But you want to stay very low level. You don't want to name the target. We always say just describe the target, don't name it. Description comes from the right brain. The right brain doesn't name things. That's a left brain function. And RV is a system that's attempting to tap into the intelligence of the right hemisphere, the bicameral mind. And so we never name what it is. That's left brain rational linear thinking. We're attempting to be holistic here and describe, as an artist would describe something, without even knowing what we're describing, but just the basics. Feeling, physically, the sensories, and I'll cue you through this so you don't have to remember this. Then some dimensional information, mass, volume, text, patterns, shapes, stuff like that. Then we do a sketch. And this is a condensed version of those sessions I showed you before, which have phases. But this is sort of like, I call this uniview. It's just the real essence of it. Draw a sketch, and then you do a little summary. What did you perceive at the target site? Colors, patterns. And you could take a little sort of a guess at it. It reminded me of this or that. And that's sort of how we do it, a brief 3-minute introduction. So what I have here Now we use coordinates, and I have some coordinates of these targets, but you could just say target 1 or 2, that's fine. By the way, I'll tell you something about the coordinates before we do this, since Joni shared her story. This originally was, like what Joni said, what's in the box, what's in the other room. They didn't know how to send anyone's mind to another continent. And Ingo and Jacques Vallée, depending who you talk to, both of them have a different version of this, came up with the idea of using coordinates. Jacques Vallée being a computer designer, thinking of memory coordinates, memory locations. And Ingo getting the idea that you could use geographical coordinates from a map. It eventually just became put random numbers on a piece of folder of anything. They didn't think it would work, and they didn't want to do it, Hal and Russell, but Ingo threatened to quit and fly back. And he was going to the airport. They said, okay, we'll do it, and it worked. But before the coordinates came along, it was just viewing things in boxes like Joni. Joni, do you remember what the object was?
No.
Okay. But it was just like that. It was viewing the thing in a box. And so it became coordinates because obviously the people paying for this, your government wanted them to view this missile site or this experimental facility, and you had to locate it, and they used geographic coordinates, and they realized you could just use any coordinates and just put them on top of the folder of the picture. Okay? So that's where coordinates came from. So glad that Joni could share that little story with us. So we're going to try our first little session here. I have a picture on the next slide. I forgot what it was. And I will just lead you through this little mini session, okay? You could just say target 1, or you could write the target coordinates down if you want on your page. So go ahead and get a piece of paper ready, and you're going to write these down on the left side of the page and your information. And if you get information that seems like noise, like it's 3D and colorful, and you suspect your left brain invented it, you put that off to the right side of the page. While the data goes on the left, and the kind of the noise that you let go of, you write it down too. The only rule here is don't edit anything out. So if it seems like noise, right side of the page, data left. Okay, so go ahead, write target 1 on your piece of paper, and you could write the time and the date. And when you're ready, put your pen on the left side and just let your hand move a little bit. Let it make an ideogram, a little squiggle, and then we'll decode your ideogram. Okay, so put your pen on the page and describe target number 1. So just basically let your hand move. And not too long. It's not much of a long motion. And when you have something there that looks like a even looking line or a squiggle or something, touch it a little bit and see how it feels and write that down. Does it feel, and again, I don't know what the target is. I forgot what it is. Does it feel hard or soft? Wet or dry? Just write down the first thing that comes to your mind as I give you these cues. Smooth or rough? And then touch the ideogram again. Does it feel man-made or natural? Or any other sort of word that comes to your mind. And let's get some sensory information about this particular target. And again, first thing that comes to your mind, you write it down. Don't second guess your colors. Temperatures. Imagine you're at this target location. Sounds. Smells. Contrasts. Ambience. Ambience is sort of like the emotional tone of any environment. Every sort of place has its own sort of ambience. And now, in your imagination, move 100 feet over the target area. In your imagination, move over 100 feet over the target area. Colors, textures, patterns, sounds, temperatures, patterns. Let's get some dimensional information. If the data slows down a little bit, just like touch your ideogram or trace it with your pen. You can trace it with your pen or your finger. Patterns, shapes, verticals, diagonals, horizontals, space, volume, and we use these same cues for every target. So, now, in your imagination, move 200 feet over the target area. Something should be surprising. Colors, patterns, shapes, size, mass, density, ambience. And if the target makes you feel a certain way, what we call a viewer impression, like it's sort of in your chair, you're feeling something about it, write that down too, on the right side. And let's go on to a sketch. Just move down the page a little bit and let your hand move around. You might have seen a glimpse of something in your mind, a pattern or a shape. Just go ahead and let your hand move on the page. And again, the biggest challenge here is kind of doubting yourself. So that's what you learn to overcome. Just let your hand move around. Or look back at what you wrote. Where do the colors, the shapes, where do they belong on the page? And go ahead and sketch a little bit. Often what comes through an RV targets are kind of surprising things that look a little different than other things. It's sort of what you can pick up as this kind of contrast. Also, repeat things that are repeated can be more easily picked up. Patterns, things like that. Okay. And is there anything that you're perceiving that you haven't written down yet? Go ahead and write that down. You're just basically using descriptors here, adjectives, adverbs, adjectives, just description. If you get a full scale noun or 3D image, that generally tends to be noise that goes off to the right side of the page. We call that analytical overlay. Okay. So when you're ready, you could write end session. And go ahead and write a little summary. Doubt is usually part of the process, so it doesn't matter. Because we're used to being very certain, but this is the opposite. This is really uncertain. But you got something. So go and write a little summary. Target contains a color, a shape, size, a temperature, whatever you got. Other impressions were whatever you've got makes me feel like. Those are all acceptable things to put in a little summary. And then we'll look at the feedback picture. And if it worked at all, you were able to kind of move into the future a little bit and see this picture that, while you were sitting there in the past, see this picture. Like being a mini time traveler. Take another couple seconds. Okay, everyone ready? Just see the feedback. Here we go. What is it? Aha! Did anyone get a structure? Get a structure. Go ahead, anyone want to share?
I was stuck on a very specific image more than an hour ago.
What was that?
But it was the tower of like a cooling tower of a nuclear power plant, which in a way resembles that.
So that's called, that can be an advanced perception. What was your name? Your name?
Oh, Rich.
Rich. So what Rich is suggesting is something, you can get perceptions of this before you, like if you know, I told her we're gonna do some sessions later, you might start viewing it. So maybe that's what the idea. Anyone else get anything metallic? Or, back there. Long and pointy. Yeah.
I got wet.
Wet? Riverside? Did anyone get any patterns? Eiffel Tower is this kind of. Oh, there's water right there. Obviously, someone got this water. It could be what's got. So this is kind of man-made. This is kind of man-made type target.
Deb's got more.
Go ahead. Anyone else?
It started just doing squiggles to begin with, but then the summary was a metal tower by a busy road, vertical, and evergreens at the base.
Wow. Metal tower, vertical metal tower.
That was surprising.
That is the key. It's surprising. The symptom of accurate data is the feeling of surprise about it. Just sort of pops in there. If it's a long, drawn-out thought and it's very filled in and very visual in your brain, that tends to be more imagination. It's just a little clue of distinguishing. This whole system is designed to separate signal from noise. You want to put the noise over here, and the signal has to be very fleeting and subtle and transient, and it's kind of there and then it's gone. You learn these things as you do it. Does anyone want to try one more before we go? Okay. This is just for fun. This is coming from your tax dollars. Your government developed this. You should have access to it. It was declassified in '95, so no one's going to come looking for you. Yeah. This is your $20 million at work. Okay, let's go. We're going to do one more. And then we'll reaching 4 o'clock. We'll finish up. So this is target number 2. I don't know what this is either. I forgot. So the same process. Write down the time, just so you know when you started. You write down the time, so when you end and put the time, you kind of let it go. So put the time. So because Rich had some advanced perceptions in the full-blown protocol, which Elaine knows since she took the class in 7th, we do have a thing in the beginning for advanced perceptions, so write them down before you start.
Yeah, and this time I don't, so that's
okay, fine. If you do have any advanced perceptions or things you want to set aside in the larger protocol, we write that down before we even begin to let it go. Okay. So target number 2, right? Target number 2, and then let your hand move on the page and draw your ideogram. Basically, put your pen on the page and just let your hand move. You don't have to think about it. You'll see this ideogram is like a little different than the previous one because it corresponds to a different place, different target. So draw your ideogram and then touch it with your finger, trace it with pen. And write down some impressions physically, as if you're reaching through space-time and you're touching whatever this target is. How does it feel when you touch it? Hard or soft, wet or dry? Man-made or natural? Any of those are fine. And then go ahead and trace your ideogram again. See if you get any more impressions. Write them down. If it's a full-blown noun, that tends to be noise that goes off to the right. That's overload. Okay, let's go to senses. Sounds. Textures. Colors. Smells. Taste. Luminosity. Ambience. Colors. Textures. Pretty much low-level data, just description. Sounds. Now imagine you're 100 feet over the target area. Something should be surprising. Colors. Taste, smells, and now let's get some dimensional information. Shapes, patterns, mass, space, volume, orientations, verticals, horizontals, diagonals. Size. Now in your imagination, move higher up, move 300 feet over the target area and describe. Shapes, patterns, colors, ambience, sounds, energetics. So you can see these are all just descriptions. And then let's move on and draw a sketch. So let your hand move around the page, or any of the words that you wrote after the ideogram, where do those belong on the page? And we can even move temporally, move forward 5 minutes in time and describe the target location. Move forward 5 minutes in time, describe the target location. Draw, sketch whatever you're seeing, describe. And is there anything you're perceiving that you haven't written down? Go ahead and write that down. Sounds, patterns, or anything else that you want to describe? Okay. So write end session and the time when you're ready. And just do a very short summary. What did you perceive at the target site? Colors, textures, temperatures, any patterns, anything that made you feel like? Or any, if it was like Rich was saying, is there some image that you had the whole time that you couldn't quite let go of, you couldn't put that into? Tends to be noise, but the noise can have elements of signal in it too, as we heard Rich talk about something. Okay? Anyone need more time? Now, in general, when we do this, you give the viewers as much time as they need, but we're in these circumstances, so we're moving it along. Everyone ready to see the feedback? Let's see what it is. Anyone get anything up in the air? What is
I drew a picture and wrote down hot air balloon right there on my screen.
Yes.
Balloons.
Balloons.
Light bulbs.
Light bulbs. So you got this shade balloon. That's good.
Brown, big, moving blue.
Round big blue. Yeah. Yeah. Blue. So, you know, if the monitor knows the target, they can move you around closer. You know, if I, in this case, I didn't know what they were. So I forgot. Anyone else want to share? What was that? So it's interesting, isn't it? It's viewing this feedback picture, but you're also at the location, even without. You could probably describe more accurately than we can even see here. Other balloons and stuff. Any other questions before we go? Okay, guys. Well, thanks. I think that's about all. Thanks very much. And if you have any other questions, want to purchase a book or anything, come up and see me. I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.